Hello, thank you for joining us today in our Delaware VDA webinar series. Today we're going to be focusing on the settlement. My name is Gwen Lawhorn and I'll be your host. Joining me today is Jamil and Kevin. Starting off, guys, how is final liability determined in the settlement process?
Yeah, so the final liability due to Delaware is based on dormant property addressable to Delaware for years where records are complete and researchable, and you combine that with estimations for years where records are incomplete and non-researchable.
The only thing I would add to that, Gwen, is that typically at the end of an audit or a VDA, there's going to be disputed properties and undisputed properties. The undisputed property is the property that the holder concedes is due and payable through the VDA process. The disputed properties would be the ones that still subject to negotiation.
Can you describe to me what should be included in the methodology narrative used for the analysis?
Sure, yeah. A methodology narrative should be a step-by-step guide through your review. Your internal audit that you conducted, it should include any property types that were included, the documentation you reviewed, the steps you took to do it, and ultimately the conclusion and liability that you reached. Just as much detail as possible helps guide the administrators of the VDA through your process, and the more details and conclusions you reach in that narrative is going to result in less follow-ups, less pushback.
What role does the state advocate play in reviewing and accepting the VDA submission?
Yeah, the state advocate or administrator, they play a really big role in the VDA process. It starts out with the scoping of the VDA, whether it's the entities, bank accounts, and things like that. And I think it's important to keep them updated along the way. If you're coming up with a methodology, it's advantageous to run it by them and get their approval, and so that you're not dragging it out at the end where they're asking questions and following up. The administrator also comes in at the end to review all the documentation you put together. They review your narrative, and ultimately they decide your final liability.
Well, how is the final payout and agreement negotiated and finalized?
It's a great question, Gwen. And as Kevin mentioned, the state advocate's going to play a very large role in final negotiation. It's going to start with a review of disputed and undisputed items. With respect to the disputed items, there's going to be some back and forth between the holder and the state advocate and the state representative about exactly what the holder is disputing, the legal basis for that dispute, and ultimately what the holder might be willing to accept from a settlement perspective. So through that process, again, the evaluation of the disputed and the undisputed items, you come up with a final liability that both parties can live with, and the settlement agreement is finalized.
Well, what protections are included in the release, and how do they benefit the parties that are involved?
Relative to the VDA, there are probably three aspects of the VDA that serve as protections for the holder. I think the first is the release of liability for the property types and for the periods covered by the VDA. This means that the state can no longer reopen those periods for review at any time in the future, even if there is a future audit. The second piece of it is the waiver of interest and penalty. It's one of the finer points and one of the benefits of the VDA for the holder. And so whatever the final liability is calculated, we're going to remove interest and penalty from that final calculation. And lastly, there's indemnity. So based on the payment that the holder makes through the settlement process, if any owners would approach the holder about those amounts, the holder would then direct those owners directly to the state for payment, because the state, again, agrees to indemnify the holder for any liabilities included in the VDA that are part of that settlement payment.
What are your top negotiation tips for presenting the findings and the methodology effectively?
Well, I think my top negotiation tip, Gwen, would be to stand your ground. As a holder, sometimes you may feel pressured to accept the state's positions that might not always be in line with what the law requires. And so if you're a holder that has a strong legal basis for disputed property or for disputing an item that the auditor or the state advocate wants to include, you need to stand your ground and push back heavily.
And I can add into that, Jamil, a little bit from the accounting perspective. anything that you find that is resolved, you want to make sure you provide the best support you can to prove that out, and also provide a narrative if necessary that really helps guide the advocates through that resolution. The more detailed and precise the support is for resolution, the less pushback you're going to get from the advocates.
And to your point, Kevin, on support, there'll be oftentimes that the holder will present what it believes is adequate support to the state advocate, and the state advocate will reject it. In those situations, you always have the option to go directly to the state to talk through that particular issue and why the holder thinks that support should be accepted. And in those situations, again, the holder just can't be afraid to go ahead and push back when they're not getting the correct response or the appropriate response from the state advocate.
How does Delaware typically request feedback or clarification during the settlement process?
Sure, Gwen. Well, during the VDA process as a whole, the holder's primary contact is going to be the state advocate. And there's a lot of back and forth between the holder and the state advocate during the VDA process about the estimation methodology or support or findings. When you get to the settlement process, the holder is going to be dealing more directly with the state representative. And in those situations, the holder is going to be able to present its case on disputed items directly to the state representative. Now, from a feedback perspective, the state representative may need to go back to the state advocate and talk through the holder's position. And so some feedback that you present to the state representative may actually get filtered back to the holder through the state advocate. But in that process, usually the state advocate is taking a step back, and the holder has a more direct line to the state representative when you're coming down to those final disputed items in the settlement process.
So the state advocate kind of works as an intermediary with the state, and the narrative works as a roadmap for them, but they have a lot of questions that the holder has done through the review. That's
exactly right. The state advocate typically is going to have more boots on the ground knowledge of how the VDA processes work for that particular holder, but it's really the state representative that's going to be the ultimate arbiter of your final settlement liability.
So after the VDA settlement, what obligations should organizations be aware of?
The big one is really to remain in compliance with the state of Delaware, meaning annual reporting, typically the minimum of 3 years. This includes filing a negative report, meaning you have no liability due that year, but you still want to file a negative report, which Delaware allows and encourages. And some other things you want to keep in mind is in best practices, you want to have a policies and procedures document on hand, which you keep updated. This will help internally your team, make the right steps towards compliance. Another thing you can do is have unclaimed property training internally. This will keep your team up to speed and help a lot towards remaining compliant.
I would piggyback off Kevin's comment about policies and procedures. Honestly, the companies have lots of turnover usually throughout their history, and having a good policy and procedure document that a new employee can plug and chug, so to speak, when a new employee comes in is really, really effective to ensure annual compliance doesn't have any hiccups when you have employee turnover.
Yeah, because especially since it's part of the VDA settlement, you're agreeing to file for those 3 years minimally, right?
That's right.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you both. That was very informative, and appreciate your insight on the Delaware VDA settlement piece. And thank you all for attending our mini webinar today. We look forward to you attending some of our other sessions. Thanks so much. Have a great day.